closer inspection, all the notches and holes in the wood took form and shape. There seemed to be a series of pictures. They were in a rough way artistic, but the figures were heavy and labored, as though they had been cut very slowly and with very awkward instruments. They were men blowing with little horned imps sitting on their shoulders and on their horses' heads. There were men praying with a skull hanging over their heads, and little demons behind them mocking their attitudes. There were men fighting with serpents, and skeletons dancing together. All about these pictures were blooming vines, and foliage such as never grew in this world, and coiled among the branches of the vines. There were always the scaly body of a serpent, and behind every flower there was a serpent's head. It was a veritable dance of death by one who had felt its sting. In the food box lay some boards, and every inch of them was cut up in the same manner. Sometimes the work was very rude and careless, and looked as though the hand of the workman had trampled. It would sometimes have been hard to distinguish the men from their evil geniuses, but for one fact, the men were always grave, and were either toiling or praying, while the devils were always smiling and dancing. Several of these boards have been split for kindling, and it was evident that the artist did not value his work highly. It was the first day of winter on the Divide. Canute stumbled into his shanty carrying a basket of cups, and after filling the stove, sat down on a stool and crouched his 7-foot frame over the fire, staring drearily out of the window at the wide grey sky. He knew by heart every individual clump of bunch grass in the miles of red jagged prairie that stretched before his cabin. He knew it in all the deceitful loveliness of its early summer, in all the bitter bareness of its autumn. He had seen it smitten by all the plagues of Egypt. He had seen it parched by drought, and soaked by rain, beaten by hail, and swept by fire, and in the grasshopper years he had seen it eaten as bare and clean as bones that the vultures have left. After the great fires he had seen it stretch for miles and miles, black and smoking as the floor of hell. He rose slowly and crossed the room, dragging his big feet heavily as though they were burdens to him. He looked out of the window into the oak corral, and saw the pigs burying themselves in the straw before the shed. The leaden grey clouds were beginning to spill themselves, and the snowflakes were settling down over the white leprous patches of frozen earth where the hogs had gnawed even the sod away. He shuddered and began to walk, trampling heavily with his ungainly feet. He was the wreck of 10 winters on the Divide, and he knew what that meant. Men feared the winters of the Divide as a child fears night, or as men in the North Seas fear the still dark cold of the polar twilight. His eyes fell upon his gun, and he took it down from the wall and looked over. He sat down on the edge of his bed and held the barrel towards his face, letting his forehead rest upon it, and laid his finger on the trigger. He was perfectly calm. There was neither passion nor despair in his face, but the thoughtful look of a man who is considering. Presently he laid down the gun, and reaching into the cupboard, drew out a pint bottle of raw white alcohol. Lifting it to his lips, he drank greedily. He washed his face in the tin basin, and combed his rough hair and shaggy beard. Then he stood in uncertainty before the suit of dark clothes that hung on the wall. For the 50th time he took it is true, it is no wonder that they feared and hated this halter of the heels of the horses. One spring there moved to the next 80, a family that made a great change in Canyone's life. Ole Jensen was too strong most of the time to be afraid of anyone, and his wife Mary was too careless to be afraid of anyone who listened to her dog. And Lena, their pretty daughter, was not afraid of men or devil. So it came about that Canute went over to take his alcohol with Ole, oftener than he took it alone. After a while, the report spread that he was going to marry Jensen's daughter, and the Norwegian girls began to tease Lena about the great pair he was about to marry. No one could quite see how the affair had come about, for Canute's tactics of courtships were somewhat peculiar. He apparently never spoke to her at all. He would sit for hours with Mary chattering on one side of him, and Ole drinking on the other, and watch Lena at her work. She teased him and threw flour in his face and put vinegar in his coffee, but he took her rough jokes with silent wonder, never even smiling. He took her to church occasionally, but the most watchful and curious people never saw him speak to her. He would sit staring at her while she giggled and flirted with the other men. Next spring, Mary Lee went to town to work in steam laundry. She came home every Sunday and always ran across to Jensen's to startle Lena with stories of 10-cent theaters, firemen's dances, and all the other aesthetic delights of metropolitan life. In a few weeks, Lena's head was completely turned, and she gave her father no rest until I let her go to town to seek her fortune at the ironing board. From the time she came home on her first visit, she began to treat Canute with contempt. She had bought a plush cloak and kid gloves, had her clothes made by the dressmaker, and assumed airs and graces that made the other women of the neighborhood cordially detest her. She generally brought with her a young man from town who waxed his mustache and wore a red necktie, and she did not even introduce him to Canute. The neighbors teased Canute a good deal, until he knocked one of them down. He gave no sign of suffering from her neglect, except that he drank more and avoided the other Norwegians more carefully than ever. He lay around in his den, and no one knew what he felt or thought. But little Jim Peterson, who had seen him glowering at Lena in church on Sunday when she was there with the town men, said that he would not give an acre of his wheat for Lena's life, or the township's either. And Jim's wheat was so wondrously worthless that the statement was an exceedingly strong one. Canute bought a new suit of clothes that looked as nearly like the town men possible. They had cost him $500,000, for tailors are not accustomed to fitting giants, and they charge for it. He had hung those clothes in his shanty 2 months ago, and had never even put them on, partly because from fear of ridicule, partly from discouragement, and partly because there was something in his own soul that revolted at the lightness of the device. Lena was at home just at this time. Work was slack in the laundry, and Merrick had not been well, so Lena stayed at home, glad enough to get an opportunity to torment Canute once more. She was washing in the side kitchen, singing loudly as she worked. Mary was on her knees, blacking the stove, and scolding violently about the young man who was coming out from town that night. The young man had committed the fatal error of laughing at Mary's ceaseless babble, and had never been forgiven. He's no good, and you will come to a bad end by running with him. I do not see why a daughter of mine should act so. I do not see why the Lord should visit such a punishment upon me as to give me such a daughter. There are plenty of good men you can marry. Lena tossed her head and answered curtly, I don't happen to want to marry any man right away, and so long as Dick dress is nice and has plenty of money to spend, there is no harm in my going with him. Money to spend, yes, that is all he does, and it will be bound. You think it is very fine now, but you will change your tune when you have been married 5 years, and see your children running naked and your cupboard empty. Did Anne Hermesen come to any good end by marrying a town man? I don't know anything about Anne Hermesen, but I know one of the laundry girls would have Dick quite enough if they could get him. shriveled up into little wrinkles that trembled when he lowered his brows. His life had been one long lethargy of solitude and alcohol, but now he was awakening, and it was as when the dumb stagnant heat of summer breaks out into thunder. When Ole came staggering in heavy with liquor, Canute rose at once. Jens, and he said quietly, "I came here to see you if you let me marry your daughter today." "Today?" gasped Ole. "Yes, I will not wait until tomorrow. I am tired of living alone." Ole braced his staggering knees against the bedstead and stammered eloquently, "Do you think I will marry my daughter to a drunkard, a man who drinks raw alcohol, a man who sleeps with rattlesnakes? Get out of my house, or I will kick you out of for your impudence." And Ole began looking anxiously for his feet. Canute answered not a word, but he put on his hat and went out into the kitchen. He went up to Lena and said without looking at her, "Get your things on and come with me." The tones of his voice startled her, and she said angrily, dropping the soap, "Are you drunk? If you do not come with me, I will take you. You had better come," said Canute quietly. She lifted the sheet to strike him, but he caught her arm roughly and wrenched the sheet from her. He turned to the wall and took down a hood and shawl that hung there and began wrapping her up. Lena scratched and fought like a wild thing. Ola stood in the door cursing, and Mary howled and screeched at the top of her voice. As for Canute, he lifted the girl in his arms and went out of the house. She kicked and struggled, but the helpless wailing of Mary and Ola soon died away in the distance, and her face was held down tightly on Canute's shoulder so that she could not see whither he was taking her. She was conscious only of the north wind whistling in her ears, and of a rapid steady motion, and of a quick great breast that heaved beneath her in quick irregular breaths. The harder she struggled, the tighter those iron arms that held her. The heels of horses crushed about her, until she felt as if they would crush the breath from her, and lay still with fear. Canute was striding across the level fields at pace at which men never went before, throwing the sting north winds into his lungs in great gulps. He walked with his eyes half closed and looking straight in front of him, only lowering them when he bent his head to blow away the snowflakes that settled on her hair. So it was that Canute took her to his home, even as his bearded barbarian ancestors took the fair frivolous women of the south in their hairy arms and bore them down to their warships. For even an Aenon the Zal becomes wary of the conventions that are not of it, and with a single stroke shatters the civilized lies with which it is unable to cope, and the strong man reaches out and takes by force what it cannot win by cunning. When Canute reached his shanty, he placed the girl upon a chair. When she sat sobbing, he stayed only a few minutes. He filled the stove with food and lit the lamp, drank a huge swallow of alcohol, and put the bottle in his pocket. He paused a moment, staring heavily at the weeping girl. Then he went over and locked the door and disappeared into the gathering gloom of the night. Wrapped in his flannels and soaked with turpentine, the little Norwegian preacher sat reading his Bible when he heard a thundering knock at his door. And Canute entered, covered sitting by the fire with her eyes red and swollen as though she had been weeping. Canute placed a huge chair for him and said roughly, "Warm yourself." Lena began to cry and moan afresh, begging the minister to take her home. He looked helplessly at Canute. Canute simply said, "If you are warm now, you can marry us." "My daughter, do you take this step of your own free will?" asked the minister in a trembling voice. "No, sir, I don't, and it is disgraceful. He should force me into it. I won't marry him." "Then, Canute, I cannot marry you," said the minister, standing as straight as his rheumatic limbs would let him. "Are you ready to marry us now, sir?" said Canute, laying one iron hand on his stooped shoulder. The little preacher was a good man, but like most men of weak body, he was suffering a coward and had a horror of physical suffering, although he had known so much of it. So with many qualms of conscience, he began to repeat the marriage service. Lena sat sullenly in her chair, staring at the fire. Canute stood beside her, listening with his head bent reverently, and his hands folded into his breast. When the little man prayed and said amen, Canute began bundling him up again. "I will take you home now," he said, as he carried him out and placed him in his buggy, and started off with him through the fury of the storm, floundering among the snowdrifts that brought even the giant himself to his knees. After she was left alone, and Lena soon ceased weeping. She was not of particularly sensitive temperament, and had little pride beyond that of vanity. After the first bitter anger wore itself out, she felt nothing more than a healthy sense of humiliation and defeat. She had no inclination to run away, for she was married now, and in her eyes that was final, and all rebellion was useless. She knew nothing about a license, but she knew that the preacher married folks. She consoled herself by thinking that she had always intended to marry Canute some day anyway. She grew tired of crying and looking into the fire, so she got up and began to look about her. She had heard queer tales about the inside of Canute's yante, and her curiosity soon got the better of her rage. One of the first things she noticed was the new black suit of clothes hanging on the wall. She was dull, but it did not take away in women long to interpret anything so decidedly flattering, and she was pleased with spite of herself. She looked through the cupboard in general air of neglect, and discomfort made her pity the man who lived there. Poor fellow, no wonder he wants to get married to get somebody to wash up his dishes. Patience pretty hard on a man. It is easy to pity when one's vanity has been tickled. She looked at the windowsill and gave a little shudder and wondered if the man were crazy. Then she sat down again and sat a long time, wondering whether Dick and Olive would do. "It is queer Dick didn't come right over after me. He surely came, for he would have left town before the storm began, and he might just as well come right on as go back. If he'd hurried, he would have gotten here before the preacher came. I suppose he was afraid to come, for he knew Canute could pound him to jelly, the coward." Her eyes flashed angrily. The very hours wore on, and Lena began to grow horribly lonesome. It was an uncanny night, and this was an uncanny place to be in. She could hear the coyotes howling angrily a little way from the cabin, and more terrible still were all the unknown noises of the storm. She remembered the tales they told of the big log overhead, and she was afraid of those shaky things on the windowsills. She remembered the man who had been killed in the draw, and she wondered what she would do if she saw Grace Hildew's white face glaring into the window. The rattling of the door became It seemed as though her mouth was close up to the keyhole. She spoke lower than he had ever heard her speak before, so low that he had to put his ear up to the lock to hear her. I don't want him either, can you? I'd rather have you. For a moment, she heard no noise at all. Then something like a groan. With a cry of fear, she opened the door and saw Kenneth stretched in the snow at her feet, his face in his hands.